Daily routine during the mobilization. Comfortably chilling. Hearing the sound of a car approaching to your house. Get paranoid. Quietly approach the window. Carefully check the street. Not today, Ivan. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This video is about demobilization in Russia. The partial mobilization was announced by President Putin a week ago. Mobilization is a conscription of people who are in the reserve, a draft into the Russian army for participation in the special military operation in Ukraine. Every Russian male citizen after reaching 18 years old and before 27 years, he must complete 1 year of mandatory military service and get his military ID. After that, you get into the mobilization reserve. Those who didn't serve due to health problems, for example, they also get their ID and get into the mobilization resource, not reserve. The same mandatory military service also exists in Finland, Switzerland, South Korea, China, and some other countries. The partial mobilization means draft only those who served in the army, has combat experience, and required specialization. At least that was promised by Putin. In fact, we see multiple violation of this decree. They try to draft people with health problems sometimes, people who didn't serve at all, and people who received a reservation from the drafts. How to get mobilized? You must receive your summons to the army personally and leave a signature. The summons tells you that you must arrive to the recruit military center. After some trainings, you will go to Ukraine. What do Russians think about demobilization? One of the most popular Google search in Russia last week is how to break an arm. All flight tickets are sold out. Huge queues at the borders. Oh, the conscientious objectors movement. It's a group of volunteers who helped Russians to replace mandatory military service with alternative civilian service. So they had about 5,000 subscribers on their Telegram channel. Now they have 35,000, and they still try to help to legally replace this mobilization service with the alternative civilian service once again. A funny thing, I was watching their broadcast where they answer random questions. So there was a woman asked to help her son, and this woman, Olga, had a Z letter on her profile picture. That's completely surreal. About the alternative civilian service, we will also talk later. What other Russians' reactions? There were some small protests on the streets because protesters got their summons into the army right after police detention. Also, there was a huge risk of criminal liability for participation in these protests. Of course, some people willingly went to the recruit centers even without getting a summons. Ways to avoid the draft. There are two categories of people: those who are in the mobilization lists and the others. Those who are in the list will get their summons one way or another. A police officer and recruiter come to your home and serve you a personal summons. You can try not to open the door and be quiet, however, they can catch you at any moment when you go to the grocery store. Usually, everything is much simpler. They will just uh, catch you at work and they will get you a summons at work where is nowhere to hide. If you don't work for a big company and if you don't live at your registration address, you are more or less safe, just like those who are not in the list. However, there is still a risk to get caught randomly on the streets. No police, 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 no police. The stupidest thing ever in this situation is going to your recruit center and asking, "Are you going to mobilize me?" Don't do this. Some categories of citizens received reservations from the draft. For example, life support workers, teachers, IT employees, fathers of many children, etc., etc. But they also get mobilized sometimes. Alternative civilian service. The Constitution allows you to replace mandatory military service with an alternative one if military service contradicts your views. For example, you are a pacifist.
Ай, сейчас убью всех, блядь! На!
I also used this right. Although formally I am in the reserve, but I didn't serve in the army and I do not have a military specialization. Instead of a year of the army, I worked a year and a half at the Russian post. By the way, write in comments if you want a video about working at the Russian post. Previously, many people laughed at me, saying like, "You are afraid to serve in the army for a year," but now perhaps this is the only reason why I am not being mobilized. However, the Mobilization Support Service stated that an alternative service in case of demobilization is not provided, but the Constitution gives me this right, so I can get a summons at any time even without having any combat experience. Perhaps I will get a replacement for an alternative civilian service through the court, or perhaps I will be forcibly sent to Ukraine. I don't know. The best way to avoid demobilization is a migration to another country. If you still didn't get a summons, you are not even violating any law. The official support service informs you about this, because it's a partial mobilization. Time to talk about hypocrisy. At the same time, Western leaders are telling Russians to flee the country, and at the same time, they are closing all land borders with Russia. Estonian border guards deported a Russian who tried to hide from the mobilization. The deputy of Latvia called for the deportation of all Russians who are subject to mobilization. Putin sends his regards. President of Ukraine, Zelensky, called on Russians to flee from the mobilization, but earlier Zelensky called for banning the giving of tourist visas to all Russians. Speaking of tourist visas, Finland has closed one of the two only open borders, the second is Norway, referring to the fact that this tourists flow needs to be stopped. Tourists? People are fleeing. They are called tourists only because they have a tourist visas? But excuse me, surprise, there are no other visas. If you don't study or work in the European Union, you are entitled only to a tourist or humanitarian visa. But no one gives humanitarian visas to Russians. So it was possible to enter only as a tourist, and the absolute majority of Russians don't even have these tourist Schengen visas. Germany has stated that they are ready to give humanitarian visas to Russians. Wow, that's very, very generous. But Russians cannot get to Germany because all land borders are closed. Air travel is not available, and you need a Schengen visa to go through Norway. You must leave Russia on humanitarian visa. I will give it to you. First, you must cross the border. That I will not give you. The only country that really want to help Ukraine and let Russians in are Georgia and Kazakhstan. These are the two most popular destinations because they have an open border with Russia and people there understand the Russian language. There is also not very popular Mongolia, where they don't speak Russian at all. The only thing migrations face there is need to 100% provide for themselves. In these countries, political asylum or humanitarian visas are not granted, and they theoretically would not be able to support 10, 30, 50,000 Russians as refugees because they are not such big and rich countries like Germany, for example. They cannot afford it. However, Russians can stay there without a visa, but they must fully support themselves, pay rent, buy food, etc. etc. So it's a very expensive option. That's why I'm still here. I live a rather ascetic life and I don't have a cash caution of several $1,000s. And I'm not some kind of IT specialist who can work from home. I don't think that a Russian speaking English language tutor will be able to find a lot of work in Germany and provide for himself. I don't even tell you about the fact that you need to pay a deposit for rent in advance. To be honest, I thought that alternative service will save me from the conscription. However, as we found out, most likely not. So I can only pray or look for a sugar daddy who will take me away from here. There are also luxury options for migration without a visa, for example, to fly to Bali, to Indonesia, or other countries. However, it's possible to live there without a visa less than in Kazakhstan and Georgia, so you need to constantly spend money on crossing any border and returning back every month or 2 months. And of course, as I said earlier, you need to find a plane ticket and the time is running. This is all for today. My mood is not great. It's a bit paranoid. A funny story, my little brother scared me to death yesterday. I live at the first floor and he knocked at my window in the middle of the night to ask some stupid question like, hey, what's up? I instinctively wanted to turn off the light in the room to pretend that I'm not here. That's the level of paranoia. Bye, see you later, maybe.